Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 10 on Ladies Talking Love, Rewriting the Script for Christians and everyone else. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. I feel like I've been gone forever, and I'm excited to jump back in to the season with this episode with Sheila Gregoire. She is the author of The Great Sex Rescue, and I heard about this book several months ago, and it took me a while, because I'm really slow at getting around to reading books, to buy it and read it, and I was just blown away. So many things resonated with the way that I had been taught in my religious background and culture. And even if there aren't specific examples that you're like, that was me, or I believed that, I think that this book gives a lot of insight into how we can talk about sex in a better way, especially in religious settings where people might be uncomfortable, especially in those settings, to talk about sex, but how it's so important to help shift some of the cultures around sexuality in evangelical religious settings. And Sheila actually went through the top-selling Christian sex books with a rubric and kind of looked at what was being taught and then surveyed 20,000 women. And it's just fascinating to see what she found was affecting these women negatively, the things that were being internalized through explicit teachings or just the religious culture in general. And this isn't to say that all religious settings or all families in religion or preachers or pastors are teaching these things, but I know that I internalize some of these things in my religious background, and I think that you might find some good insight and discussion topics to talk about after listening to this episode. Sheila Gregoire is the face behind To Love, Honor, and Vacuum.com, the largest single blogger marriage blog. A sought-after speaker, she's also an award-winning author of 9 books, including The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex and The Great Sex Rescue. Sheila has spoken at churches and conferences around the globe. She is a frequent contributor at Family Life Canada events. Her latest book, The Great Sex Rescue, was featured in the New York Times Book Review, Publishers Weekly, and the Washington Post. She has bylines at Religion News Service, Relevant Magazine, and other news sources. Sheila and her husband, Keith, a pediatrician, live in Belleville, Ontario. They have 2 grown daughters and 1 very adorable grandson who lives down the road. She enjoys hiking, bird watching, RV camping trips, and board games. And she knits, even in line at the grocery store. As we're jumping into a new year, I've just been thinking about the podcast and Instagram page, and I just really hope it will be a place for you to come and get good information. But even more than that, I hope it's a place to start conversations with your partner. I think one of the most important things we can do to shift the culture around sexuality and help improve our own sexual experiences is to talk, to really open up these conversations about things that we haven't thought about before, that our partner hasn't thought about before, that really dig into what we both feel and think and are experiencing and ways that we can improve our sex lives. And I hope this will be a safe place for you to find answers to questions that you've had. And even if it's not an answer to a question, that it'll inspire a conversation for you and your partner to really look at the information, but also take what is going to work for you, because we're all different. I loved getting your thoughts and ideas about Christmas gifts. And I loved that there were so many different ideas, that some couples don't do Christmas gifts for each other. And some, like me, gifts are so important to me. And to be able to see that there's not a right way or a wrong way, but it's really just looking at information that can broaden our understanding and open up conversations. And then we can take that and decide together what's going to work for our marriage. So without further ado, let's talk love. I'm super excited to welcome Sheila Gregoire onto Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks so much for joining me, Sheila.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
This is just such an awesome thing to have you on. Your new book, The Great Sex Rescue, is just a fantastic resource for kind of helping shift some of the culture around sexuality, especially some of the culture that has sometimes gotten into religious teachings. And so I would love to hear, just to start off, what kind of inspired you to survey the women from your blog and from the women that you knew, which then kind of inspired you to write the book?
Well, I have been blogging at lovehonorandvacuum.com since 2008. And I started out as a mommy blogger, like parenting and organization and housework and stuff. But the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. And so I kind of morphed into this sex place, which was weird. And in 2012, I wrote The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, which became quite a big book. And I followed it up with 31 Days to Great Sex. And I was creating courses on sex and all kinds of stuff on how to have great sex. But I hadn't actually read the other books in the Christian world on marriage and sex because I always was afraid of plagiarizing and I never had a lot of time anyway. So I would recommend them and I would say, I heard this was a great book, but I'd never actually read it. And then in 2019, in January, one afternoon, I sat down, I had a migraine and I was just procrastinating. And I pulled Love and Respect off my shelf by Emerson Eggerichs. It's one of the best-selling marriage books. It's the most widely used marriage study in North America. And I turned to the sex chapter and it was like a nuclear bomb went off in my living room. It was awful. It said, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. So men need sex and women don't. It said things like a husband needs physical release through sexual intimacy, and you need to minister to him sexually as unto Jesus Christ. And if he doesn't get release, he'll come under satanic attack. And there was not a single word in that entire chapter about the fact that a woman could feel pleasure too. It was just all obligation, all about him. And I thought, oh my gosh, if this is what the Christian world is teaching, no wonder we're messed up. And so on my team, I had a woman who is actually a statistician and epidemiologist. And then my daughter was working for me and she has a history in psychometrics and survey development. And we just thought, why don't we just figure this out? And so we ended up surveying 20,000 women. About 40% of them came from my blog and the other 60%, other people were sharing our links. So we got them from all over. And we just looked at what teachings that are really prominent in the church actually hurt women's marital and sexual satisfaction. And that was the point of our study.
It was so fascinating to hear just what women experience. And so what were some of the harmful themes that you found in these Christian books?
Well, there were four big ones. But of those four, there's kind of one that rules them all. It's kind of, like Lord of the Rings, the one ring that binds them all together. I think there's this one teaching that binds them all together. And it really is that idea that Emerson Eggerichs said, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have. Sex is for the man. And even if you think about our definition of sex, in the very way that we define sex, we actually believe that.
Totally.
Because if I were to ask you, did you have sex last night? Which I won't, but if I were to ask you that, the question that people think I'm asking is something to do with him putting his penis into her vagina and moving around till he climaxes. What we're picturing is intercourse.
Mm-hmm.
But with that definition, she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head, right? She could be in emotional turmoil. She could even be in physical pain and it would still count as having sex.
Yep.
And that is not how the Bible talks about sex. If you actually look at scripture, the Bible talks about sex as being this deeply intimate, personal thing. Adam knew his wife Eve. And it sounds like a strange phrasing, but the same root there is in the Psalms when David says, search me and know me, O God, right? It's this longing for connection. So sex isn't just about a husband's physical release. Sex is a deep longing for connection. We know it's pleasurable for both. I don't know why Emerson Eggerichs didn't know that, but we know that from the Song of Solomon, and we know that it's totally mutual. And so that's the picture that we should be getting, is something which is intimate, pleasurable, and mutual that encompasses everything. So it has to encompass her experience as well, and not just his.
Yes. Oh, I totally agree. And I feel like we just need a revamp of what sex means. And use those separate words like intercourse and sex, which
Yes.
includes foreplay and women's pleasure and all these things. Cause so many women, we go in thinking, oh, penetration, that's what sex is. And it's so much more with the connection and love and pleasure. And we have so much from your book that we could cover. I tried to narrow it down to a couple of things to talk about today, but I was curious to hear more of your thoughts on gatekeeping. So to start off, can you just let us know, like, what is a gatekeeper?
Yeah, so that was one of the teachings that we measured that we found was quite harmful. And it's this idea that boys will push your sexual boundaries. So girls are put in the position of gatekeeper. And by that, I mean that it's girls who are responsible for putting the brakes on things. It's girls who are responsible for making sure that things don't go too far because he can't help himself. And that's the message that we've given girls. And I would argue that we give girls that message outside the church as well, but it's definitely given inside the church. Just as an example, Shanti Feldhahn wrote a book called For Young Women Only that was really big for teenage girls in the early 2000s. In it, she did this survey of guys, and I don't believe this survey question was done properly, nor did she give the answers properly. But regardless of all that, what she claimed after doing the survey was that 82% of boys feel little ability and little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. So if you want to stop, it's better to not even start. To say that 82% of boys have little ability to stop is just rape culture. Like, what are you doing? And yet that is what we told this whole generation of girls. And so then you have a girl in basically a date rape situation, and she doesn't recognize that it's a red flag. She just thinks this is how all boys are. Or even if it doesn't get to a date rape situation, the whole time they're making out, he's enjoying himself. He's getting aroused. He's thinking this is great. But what she's doing, and when in our focus groups, we talked to a number of women who experienced this. One of them called it spectatoring. She said, it's almost like I'm outside myself and I'm watching what's happening. And I'm thinking, is he getting too excited yet? Do I need to put the brakes on yet? And so she wasn't really inhabiting her body. She was just judging what was going on and trying to figure out when to stop it. I'm not arguing that, teenage kids should make out like crazy and we should stop all that. Not at all. That's not the point. The point is we need to find a healthier way of talking about this. And that's what we're suggesting in the book is instead of saying boys will push your sexual boundaries, so girls just do this gatekeeping thing and then don't recognize red flags. We should say, hey kids, it's normal to want to have sex. And it's normal to have sexual feelings, but you need to figure out what your boundaries are and you need to make a plan to stick to it. But even more importantly, you need to honor the boundaries of the person you're with. And if you're with someone who doesn't honor your boundaries, that's a red flag that relationship's not safe.
Totally.
And that's the kind of message we can give instead.
Yeah. And even in relationships where boys might not be pushing the boundaries, I feel like a lot of, from my own experience, I definitely still felt like a gatekeeper and was like, oh, I have to be on my toes watching what's happening. And it really affects you in a way that you view male sexuality as kind of being uncontrollable, which, like you were saying, like men and women are both in charge of respecting each other. Yeah. And I think that's such an important shift. So what did you notice then with women who were feeling this need to be a gatekeeper because of how we've been talking about male sexuality? How did that affect them going into their marriages?
Yeah. So we talked about this a lot in chapter 4, and this was the one chapter we weren't actually expecting to write. It's kind of interesting because we didn't realize this was a thing until we did all these focus groups. And so many women told us about this, is that they never understood what arousal was. It was like arousal was the missing piece because they had never let themselves feel aroused when they were dating. And again, I'm not arguing that we should let kids do that. That's not the point. The point is just the one-sided gendered way that we did it. And by setting women up as gatekeepers, they didn't know how to inhabit their bodies once they got married. They didn't know how to tune back in because they had been so used to tuning out and concentrating so much on what he was feeling. They had no idea what they were feeling or even to figure out how to feel something. And so it's like they went straight from non-aroused to penetration, and sex didn't feel very good. And often women even experienced vaginismus, which is a big problem we were looking at in the book as well, because Christian women experience sexual pain at more than twice the rate of the general population. And a lot of it is these weird dynamics that we get ourselves into.
So what are some of the things we can do to shift this culture? And let's talk first about women who are maybe already in relationships. And maybe you're like, I don't know how to feel arousal. I'm realizing I was a gatekeeper and maybe I haven't been able to overcome some of those harmful effects.
I mean, we have a whole orgasm course on this on our website for people that are really having trouble with it. But, I think the big thing once you're married is like, just go back to the basics. Go back to all those steps that you missed. I remember, and maybe this is just betraying my age a little bit, but when I was a kid, we watched Happy Days. Like that sitcom was really, really big. And Richie Cunningham, who's Ron Howard, played Richie Cunningham. And he had this song he would sing all the time. I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill. Like every time they went to the makeout point, which was Blueberry Hill. And it was never about having sex. It was just about like these big makeout sessions. And that was the thrilling thing. And I think a lot of us missed out on that. And so we never really learned how to get aroused. And part of the reason that making out as teenagers is so arousing is because it's not going anywhere. And like you're not progressing to sex. And so you can just totally enjoy what's going on in the moment. And I think we need to give ourselves permission to just enjoy what's going on in the moment without thinking about what's happening next. And that may mean taking intercourse off the table for a while and just learning how to re-inhabit your body. It might mean setting a timer and just touching it, like letting yourself be touched for a while, because often women are so self-conscious. It's like, he's getting bored by this. He shouldn't have to keep doing this. I'm taking too long, and so giving yourself that freedom to just let yourself be touched, whatever it might be, to get yourself back in touch with your body.
Which is so hard to do, but also so important. And I love how you talk about, just slowing down, taking time, having just a makeout session that doesn't go anywhere, taking time to just touch and be together. I think that is such an important thing that we could all use, even people who maybe have overcome some of the effects. It's always good to come back into our bodies fully.
Yes.
We kind of touched on this a little bit when you talked about the idea of sex being a need for men. But can you tell us a little bit about what duty sex is?
Yeah. So, and this was probably the most damaging message that we measured, but it's this idea that a wife is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. So we called it the obligation sex message. And we normally think of it as something like duty sex. And basically what this does is it turns sex from something intimate, where you're experiencing something together, into something which she now owes him. And if she owes it to him, then what she is feeling doesn't matter. And the whole point of intimacy is that both of you matter. The point of knowing each other in that Hebrew word, Adam knew his wife Eve, is that both of you are vitally important and both of your needs matter. But obligation sex says her needs don't matter compared to his. And so it erases her as a person. So sex, which is supposed to be this deep knowing, actually becomes one of the most depersonalizing, dehumanizing things you can do, because it's an erasure of her as a person, and it's just using her as a body. And this is just so destructive. In fact, if you believe the obligation sex message when you're married, the extra chance of you having vaginismus, it increases to almost the same statistical effect as if you had been abused.
That's crazy.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
It's like our bodies interpret obligation sex as trauma because it is.
And how are some of the ways that this may have been taught to us growing up, and how did we internalize this message?
So once we finished our survey of 20,000 women, we created a 12-point rubric of healthy sexuality teaching. And we took the 10 best-selling marriage books and 6 iconic sex books and applied a rubric to those books. And the one marker that the books collectively scored the worst on was the obligation sex message. Like, this is something which we do really badly in the Christian church. Like, we really preach obligation sex, that it is a need that men have, that women have to give. And in the books, we often hear talked about the 72-hour rule, which became a thing for women, where you need to give them sex every 72 hours. this thing is repeated, and we couldn't find the source for it. We looked at all the medical literature. Is there something about hour 73 that makes men, grumpier or more sexually frustrated? We couldn't find anything. And then we finally located it. It was in a book by James Dobson in 1977, but it's got no basis in anything.
That is so fascinating. And we have so far to go.
Yeah.
How did these things happen?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for writing this book. Oh my goodness. Some women might be like, I haven't heard some of those, but I hope that some of the things we cover in this interview today, for sure, I think a lot of us have internalized in some way, whether a lot or a little bit. So how do we move past this idea of duty sex?
The problem with obligation sex, I think the reason that it's preached so much is because there's general agreement that the big problem with sex in marriage is that men want it and women don't. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that women give it because men need it. And the only way to make sure that women give it is to tell women that they have to. And so this is what's preached. Now, interestingly, when we actually look at our stats, what we found is that frequency is not the problem. Libido is not actually the problem. This is what our books are defining as the problem, but it's not the problem. Because if women have frequent orgasms, if they feel emotionally close during sex, if they have high marital satisfaction, if they don't have sexual pain, and if there's no porn use, frequency totally takes care of itself.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there can be outliers, but on the whole, frequency takes care of itself. And so instead of telling women, you just need to have more sex, we should start asking, why is sex not happening? Where did her libido go? What has killed her libido? And figure that part out. And it isn't always something that he did. Like, that's one of the big messages from our book is a lot of the stuff that's killed women's libidos is how we talk about sex.
Yeah.
And so she doesn't feel emotionally close to him during sex, but it's not necessarily his fault. It's all these internalized beliefs. And when we can get rid of those beliefs, we free her to really enjoy sex. But we've got to get to the root of what the problems are. And so instead of focusing on obligation, let's focus on sex as being something which she should want. Women are capable of multiple orgasms. We have a body part that's specifically for pleasure. Like, we are made to be sexual. So if we don't want sex, there must be a reason.
Yeah.
So let's figure that reason out.
Totally. And it's almost like we've separated within our relationships. It's like sex is this different part. And it's like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
It's totally integrated. Anything that's coming up in your relationship where you're not feeling connected or supported, like that's going to show up in the bedroom.
Yeah.
And also, like you were saying, all these internalized views, I think we see sex as just a need, then it totally takes away the connection and love and the reason that I think that God gave us this gift of sex. And so bringing that back in and like you said, I think so many of the men in our lives want their wives to have great sex, and they're there. They just maybe don't realize some of the messages we've internalized.
Yeah.
And the women don't know how to express maybe what they're feeling. And one sex educator that I really like, I remember I was at a conference of hers, and a woman was talking about how she and none of her friends like sex. And she was just like, you must not be having good sex then. If we can shift the culture around what sex is and the connection, but also the pleasure, I think the libido takes care of itself.
Yeah.
If we're actually having sex.
Yeah. And that's really the missing piece for a lot of people. Like, it really bothers me that all of the books talk about obligation sex and the problem with women not wanting sex, and nobody addresses the orgasm gap.
Yeah.
Because the orgasm gap is huge.
It's huge.
Like, we found in our men's survey, and we've done the men's survey since the book was published, but we found that 95% of men, as we suspected, almost always or always reach orgasm during a sexual encounter. And the equivalent number for evangelical women is closer to 48%. So that's a 47-point orgasm gap.
It's huge.
So if you want to know why women don't want sex, ask a guy how he would feel if he didn't orgasm, and then he was told he needed to do this several times a week.
Yeah. Totally sexually frustrated. What are some of your thoughts about after being immersed in this culture where it's almost like we don't trust men sexually, and then
Yeah.
we need to give them sex so that they aren't looking elsewhere. You mentioned that a lot of us have internalized this idea. What are some ways that we can shift this mindset and start to see both of us as equal partners and equally responsible?
Yeah. Yeah. Because a lot of the sex conversation in the church is really about sin avoidance. You have sex so that he doesn't sin, whether it's lusting or watching porn or having an affair. You need to fill his cup up so that he won't be tempted. And that is like the least sexy thing you can possibly say to a woman.
It's all about fear.
I know. I read something from a woman whose husband was involved in campus ministry. And they were taught that the mornings before he met in large groups, it was very important to send him off to work, having sex first in the morning so that he wouldn't be tempted that day. And oh my goodness. And this is what this campus ministry taught these couples. We need to start owning our own stuff. And I think part of the problem is that our books have a very low view of men. Every Man's Battle literally says, in talking about men's propensity towards sexual sin, that they got there naturally simply by being male. So this idea is that men just are made to sin. Like the male sex drive innately sins. And the male sex drive is simply about objectifying women. And it's such a low view of men. And I think we need to call men to more, because men are not animals.
No, they are not. They're amazing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this stems from a misunderstanding of what lust is. I think a lot of people confuse sexual attraction or noticing a woman is beautiful with lusting. And they're not. Like Jesus didn't say whoever notices a woman has a nice chest has lusted after her. He said whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. So it's a deliberate action combined with a deliberate mindset. So noticing a woman is beautiful is not lusting. You know, finding someone attractive is not lusting. It's what you do with it. And I think that we need to stop shaming men for finding women attractive and start normalizing, yeah, you might think she's attractive, but move on with your day. And I think that we need to get away from this idea that women are dangerous and that men can't help themselves, and get back to an integrated idea of what true community and intimacy means.
Yeah. And to see each other as full people. You touched on this in the book, and it's something in my religious culture that I felt growing up about, like modesty culture, and just how I've been thinking about recently, how when we teach modesty as in a dress code, modesty is so much more in my view. It's not just a dress code.
Yes.
It's the way we act and interact and think. But when we focus on it as a women's dress code to protect men, I just think that we're just doing such a disservice to men to view them in this way that they can't control themselves. I just love this idea of looking at men as amazing and totally full human beings as well. Because I think that's one of the saddest parts about the objectifying of women and modesty culture is that we view men as less than, and they're not. And they are so powerful and so good. And we're perpetuating this culture that's harmful for both of us. And we need to come together.
Yeah, totally.
What can we do then, especially for those of us who have kids or have interaction with kids in our church or in our community? What can we do to help our boys and girls grow up in a better place where they can see each other's sexuality as a gift and something that's healthy and something that can be value-based without demeaning each other?
I think there just needs to be more of an expectation that, or more of an understanding, it's okay for kids to have sexual feelings. They don't need to feel ashamed of that, but everybody needs to respect each other. What young people really get is justice. The next generation is very concerned with justice and with treating people well. And if we can make this into a justice issue, it really is a lot better. So, just tell people, look, you might find someone attractive, but you need to treat them with respect. You need to always treat someone with respect. And most young people totally get that. So I think it's very important that we just set the expectation that no matter what anyone's wearing, you can treat them with respect.
I really like that idea of looking at it as a justice issue. As we close up, can you just give some tips for women, for couples starting on this journey of reclaiming our sexuality? And I like in the book, you say in the way that God intended it to be.
I think it really comes down to recognizing what messaging you grew up with. I think a lot of us have never actually asked ourselves that question because we tend to assume the messaging that we grew up with It's just in the water. It's just the way things are. We don't always question it. We don't see it as, oh, that might actually be weird because
or super harmful.
We've never challenged it. And so walking with each other, walking through each other's stories and saying, what was the first time you heard about sex? How did you feel? What was the context? When you first hit puberty, what was the context? What were the messages that you were given? What were some of your first sexual experiences? And for a lot of us, it was abuse. And that needs to be talked through, especially with the trauma therapist.
Yeah.
Talk through these things and understand the messages that we were given, sometimes not even consciously, but that we just imbued from the water. And then ask yourself, now, what is it like? What do we want our sex life to look like? If we really lived in passion and freedom, what would that look like for us? And how can we get there?
Yeah.
And then just realize it's a journey. You don't need to get there tomorrow, because sex isn't something that you arrive at. It's not something that you get. It's something you experience together. And hopefully it will be a richer and richer experience. The more you become vulnerable with each other, the more you're able to trust each other and grow in safety, then passion will also be able to grow.
It's a journey throughout because it changes throughout our life. And I love this idea too, when we can open up that conversation with our partner, be like, this is what I internalized. I'm realizing I internalized this view of you. Is this true? Let's talk about this. And I think that's such a powerful way to really learn what's happening in our partner's head and see, where can we find you, Sheila?
Well, The Great Sex Rescue is everywhere books are sold. It's doing really well. When we wrote it, we assumed that only women would be reading it, but we've heard from so many men, which is just amazing.
That's awesome.
Go to lovehonorandvacuum.com. And then if you click on my books, The Great Sex Rescue is there, or you can find it on Amazon or anywhere else. And then our podcast is the Bare Marriage Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been awesome.
Well, thank you.
I hope this episode gave you a lot of things to think about and talk about with your spouse. One thing that has stuck out to me was just that thought from that conference I went to, and the girls comment about, well, none of us like sex. Sex is awful. And the presenter just kind of turned to her and said, well, you must not be having good sex. And just when Sheila was talking about how libido is one of the biggest issues that comes up a lot around women's sexuality, that women just don't want to have sex, and that she has found that when connection is there between couples and orgasm is there and marital satisfaction, that there isn't pain, that there isn't any pornography use, that the frequency takes care of itself. And I just thought that was so interesting, that a lot of the issue that I think we focus on with low libido or frequency not being enough, I think a lot of those issues can actually be solved just by realizing what sex is really about, that it's about connection and trust and mutual pleasure and fulfillment within your marriage. And I hope that Sheila gave you some good tips and things that maybe you'll notice some dialogue happening in your religious culture or your family or just in the community or movies around that you can realize like, wow, that really is portraying women or men in a negative way. And I want to change that in my own dialogue or the way I talk with my kids, or to find out if that's really how my spouse feels about things. I know that's been important for me to realize, wow, I really believed that it was my obligation to give my husband sex, or whatever the belief is, to kind of question and say, is that how you feel? And those have opened up some really good conversations. As always, thanks for tuning in and learning with me and talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.